I want the Wiltshires moved to the secondary table. They do not deserve a view of the lilies.
Lady Cordelia Thornbury said it without lowering her voice, because she wanted it heard. Around her, the great hall of Thornbury Hall had become a hive. Footmen carrying in armfuls of white lilies, a girl on a ladder threading ivy through the banisters, 2 men easing a crate of crystal across the marble so slowly you'd think it was made of eggshell. There was to be a wedding here. The grandest of the season, people were already calling it, and Cordelia had decided they were right. She turned to the footman beside her and tapped one ringed finger against the seating plan, close to the bride's table, close enough to smell the wine she'll never drink. Yes, my lady. 2 ladies near the window laughed behind their gloves. Cordelia let herself enjoy the sound. Across the hall, in a smaller room hung with mirrors, Lady Beatrice Thornbury sat very still, while a seamstress pinned the last of her gown. Tomorrow she would marry the Duke of Ravensworth, Edmund Ravensworth, a man with a name older than half the counties in England, a man the whole of society agreed she had been clever to catch. Every door of every great house would open to her after tomorrow. Dukes, earls, the cousins of the crown itself, and among all of them, one guest who did not belong to any of it. Her name was Rosalind, Lady Rosalind Hartwell, Beatrice's elder stepsister, and a woman neither she nor her mother had laid eyes on in 8 years. On a side table near Cordelia's elbow lay a single cream-colored invitation, edged in gold, with Rosalind's name written across it in a careful hand. It was not a kindness. Cordelia did not deal in kindness. It was a stage. A chance to set the poor, forgotten daughter down beside the glittering life she had supposedly thrown away and let the whole of England watch her sit there in her mended dress. She'll come, Cordelia said. Women like that always come. Give them one last look at the life they lost, and they cannot help themselves. The ladies laughed again. Beatrice managed to smile, but something in the talk pressed against her, the way a stone presses through the sole of a thin shoe. For just a moment, she remembered a different Rosalind, the sister who used to read to her by candlelight until her own eyes drooped, the sister who held her hand through thunderstorms, the sister who once swore, in the dark, that Beatrice would never be left alone. Then the memory was gone, the way they always went, because for 8 years her mother had told her the other story. Rosalind left us. Rosalind chose to go. Rosalind wanted nothing to do with this family. And if that wasn't true, why had she never come back? Why had she never written? Why had she never once tried? Perhaps she won't come after all, Beatrice said. Her mother's smile only widened. Oh, she will. Neither of them noticed the old woman by the doorway. She was a maid, grey-haired, narrow as a reed, and she had stood in this house long enough to have grown into its shadows. The others moved past her as though she were a coat stand. But unlike everyone else in that bright, busy room, the old maid knew exactly what had happened 8 years ago. She knew who had truly been put out of doors. She knew whose name had been blackened, and who had done the blackening. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who has carried a thing too long, that if Lady Rosalind Hartwell walked back through those doors, some truths have a way of refusing to stay buried. Miles away, in a rented room beneath a leaking roof, Rosalind sat alone with the same invitation trembling in her hands. In spite of everything, in spite of the silence, and the years, and the way the betrayal still woke her some nights, with her heart going too fast, in spite of all of it, a part of her still ached for the little sister she had once loved like her own child. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and if a story of family, betrayal, and the kind of justice that takes its time is the sort of thing that keeps you up too late, subscribe to Duke and Duchess Stories and join our growing family. Now, let us begin. Rosalind folded the dark blue nursing apron she had worn through her final examinations and laid it gently in the wooden chest by her bed. For a long moment she just stood there looking at it. 8 years, and she had done it. She was a qualified nurse now, with the papers to prove it and the calluses to back them up. It ought to have filled her with pride. Instead, the little room felt strangely quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that has a sound of its own. Rain came down soft over the cobbles outside her window. A carriage rolled through a puddle below. A man hurried by with a parcel pressed to his chest. No one was coming up the stairs to celebrate. No father, no mother, no sister. Only the rain, and the memories, and the room. And the room held almost nothing. A narrow bed, a washstand with a chip in the basin, a wooden chair, a shelf of worn medical books she had bought one at a time, going without supper to do it, a small iron stove that lost its battle against the damp every single evening. She had earned every object in that room with her 2 hands. She remembered scrubbing the floors of coaching inns before the sun came up. She remembered washing linen until the skin split across her knuckles. She remembered standing for hours in kitchen heat, plating food she could not afford to taste, and studying anatomy by a candle stub until the letters swam. More than one morning she had woken with her cheek stuck to an open page, and not once had she let the dream go. A soft knock. Her closest friend, Genevieve Marsh, came in with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. A celebration, Genevieve announced, requires cake. It was not much of a cake, a little sponge under a thin skin of icing, bought from the baker on the corner. To Rosalind it was a feast. They ate it by the stove, and her eyes drifted to the framed portrait on the shelf her father, painted when his hair was still dark. The sight reopened a wound that had never fully closed. 8 years ago, everything had changed in the space of a week. Her father died on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, Lady Cordelia Thornbury had told her, quite calmly, over a breakfast Rosalind was not invited to eat, that she was no longer welcome at Hartwell Court. She could still see herself standing in the entrance hall with a suitcase in her hand while the servants found other things to look at. She had braced herself for grief. She had not understood, yet, that she was being thrown away. They let her keep a few books, nothing else. As the carriage pulled down the long drive, she looked back through the rear glass, half believing someone would run out and stop it. No one did. The rumors came after. People whispered that the Hartwell girl had abandoned her family, that she'd run off chasing some notion of independence, that she wanted no part of her grieving stepmother or her motherless little sister. Every word of it was a lie, and the lie traveled faster than the truth ever could. But the cruelest part was Beatrice. As children, the 2 of them had been stitched together. Rosalind taught her to read, tracing the words with her own finger. She brushed Beatrice's hair before bed and counted the strokes out loud to make her laugh. When Beatrice scraped her knee in the garden, it was always Rosalind who carried her back inside. For years after she left, Rosalind wrote to her. She waited for an answer the way you wait for a fever to break. None came. In the end, she made herself believe that Beatrice simply no longer cared. It was easier than the truth, which she did not yet know. A second knock. The boarding house keeper handed up a cream envelope edged with gold. Rosalind frowned. Very few people had her address. She broke the seal, and as she read, her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. A wedding invitation. Lady Beatrice Thornbury requested the honor of her presence at the marriage of herself to His Grace the Duke of Ravensworth. For a long while she only stared at the page. 8 years without a letter. 8 years without a visit. And now this. Genevieve read it over her shoulder, and her face went hard. You're not thinking of going? Rosalind didn't answer. Burn it. After what they did to you, Rosalind, nothing good has ever come out of that house, and nothing good will start now. Perhaps she was right. The invitation made no sense. Why now? Why? After all these years, would they want the daughter everyone said had walked away? But even as the warnings landed, the old memories came up to meet them. Beatrice laughing in the garden. Beatrice reaching for her hand. Beatrice, small and serious, calling her big sister. I have to go, Rosalind said. They will hurt you, perhaps. And if they humiliate me in front of every titled fool in England, I'll survive that too. I survived worse from them already. She set the invitation down. I still want to see her. That evening, she opened the wardrobe by her bed. Inside hung one dress fit for such a thing modest, Several years out of fashion, mended at the cuff where she'd hoped no one would look, nothing remotely like the gowns that would crowd a duke's wedding. She stood before the spotted mirror and smoothed the fabric with hands that would not quite hold still. Thornbury Hall, when the day came, was everything Cordelia had promised it would be. Carriages crowded the drive 3 deep. Women stepped down in silk traveling gowns, trimmed with lace and seed pearls. Gentlemen followed in tailored coats and polished boots. Gold watch chains looped across their waistcoats. Rosalind's own dress was neat and respectable, and unmistakably poor. For the first time since she'd left her boarding house that morning, she regretted coming. A footman checked her name against his list, raised one eyebrow a fraction of an inch, and led her inside. The hall glittered under chandeliers the size of cartwheels. Portraits of ancestors who had never met her looked down with painted indifference. Silver trays floated through the crowd carrying things she had not eaten in years: pastries, sugared fruit, smoked salmon laid out like coins. And the moment she stepped into the light, the whispering began. 2 women glanced at her and leaned together. A gentleman studied her hem and let his eyebrow do the talking. Somewhere a remark was passed that drew a soft ripple of laughter. Rosalind kept her eyes level and kept walking. Years of hardship had taught her, if nothing else, how to walk through a room that did not want her. Then she saw Beatrice near the foot of the great staircase, and for one breath she almost smiled. Her little sister was beautiful. The ivory gown might have been made for her. Diamonds caught the light at her throat. White roses had been worked into her dark hair with a patience that must have taken hours. Their eyes met across the crowd. Something crossed Beatrice's face: surprise, uncertainty, perhaps even the edge of guilt. Then it folded itself away, and what was left was a smile you'd give a stranger you half remembered. "Thank you for coming, Rosalind." The words were smooth and rehearsed, and 10 years too cool. "You look well," Rosalind said gently. She meant it. Beatrice nodded, already glancing at the guests nearby, already gone. The whole exchange was over before it had properly begun, and a hollow opened in Rosalind's chest. 8 years had taken her sister and left a polite acquaintance wearing her face. Dear Rosalind. Lady Cordelia swept in, emerald gown hissing across the marble, voice warm enough to fool anyone within earshot. She pressed a featherlight embrace on her stepdaughter. "We are so very pleased you accepted." Rosalind understood at once that the performance was for the watching crowd. Still, she made herself answer kindly. There is a kind of strength in refusing to give a cruel person the scene they're fishing for. The first cut came a moment later. Cordelia ran her eye down the mended dress with a smile stretched too wide. How practical. I suppose nursing teaches one to make do with simple things. A few ladies traded amused looks. Rosalind pretended not to see them. Later, over refreshments, Cordelia steered her into a knot of aristocratic guests. "This is my stepdaughter, Lady Rosalind Hartwell. She has spent the last several years supporting herself." The words were harmless, and the tone was a blade. It made an achievement sound like a confession. "Supporting yourself? How?" one woman asked. "A governess, perhaps a lady's companion?" When Rosalind said she had trained as a nurse, surprise went round the circle like a draft. One woman looked nearly scandalized. A nurse. Another smiled, the careful smile people use for unfortunate news. What unusual employment for a lady. The conversation moved off without her. She understood the judgment hiding under the manners. To half the room, nursing was not a profession a woman of birth lowered herself to. As the evening drew on, the crowd thickened. Important people arrived from London and beyond. The ballroom filled with music and laughter and the particular noise a great many privileged people make when they are pleased with themselves. And then came the worst of it. Cordelia raised her voice before a wide gathering of guests, and the practiced warmth in it could have curdled milk. "I am so glad to have both my daughters here tonight." She paused, letting the room settle on her. One of them stayed loyal to her family. The other chose to leave us. Many years ago. A murmur ran through the crowd. Rosalind felt dozens of eyes find her at once. Some faces softened into pity, others hardened into disapproval. The story England had been told for 8 years suddenly had a face to pin it to the daughter who abandoned her family, the selfish girl who walked away. No one questioned it. No one asked her side. The whispering spread through the room like smoke under a door, and Rosalind stood inside it and said nothing, because arguing would only have given them the spectacle they'd paid for. But across the ballroom, one woman had been watching everything. Lady Adelaide Wycliffe was old and sharp and closely enough related to the crown that when she spoke, rooms tended to quiet. She had been seated among the most distinguished guests, and from there she had observed every glance, every leaning whisper, every insult dressed up in good manners. She had watched the cruel introduction and the careful laughter and the young woman in the mended dress who absorbed all of it without once losing her composure. As a fresh laugh broke out near Cordelia, Lady Adelaide rose slowly from her chair. The movement alone turned heads. Then she looked directly at Cordelia Thornbury and asked a single question that brought the whole hall to silence. "Tell me, Lady Thornbury, if this young woman abandoned her family, why does she appear to be the only person in this room behaving with any dignity at all?" The laughter died. The music faltered. The musicians glanced at one another, unsure whether to play on. Every eye swung to Cordelia. Her confident smile slipped just for a heartbeat, and then years of practice came to her rescue. She gave a light, gracious laugh and turned the emerald bracelet on her wrist. "My dear Lady Wycliffe, I fear you have quite misunderstood the situation." "Then I should be delighted to understand it correctly," Lady Adelaide said, and did not sit down. A few nervous chuckles rippled and died. Cordelia pressed on. "My stepdaughter left this family many years ago. We were heartbroken. We tried, more than once, to help her. She chose her own path." Several guests nodded. It was the story they had always heard, the one society had swallowed whole. Lady Adelaide turned her gaze on Rosalind. "Is this true?" For a moment, Rosalind wished the polished floor would open and take her down. She had spent 8 years surviving. She had never once imagined laying that survival out before half the aristocracy of England. But something in the old woman's steady look gave her a courage she had not felt all evening. "No, my lady." The two small words carried clean across the hall. The silence deepened. Rosalind clasped her hands to keep them still. "My father died 8 years ago." She heard her own voice from a little distance, the way you do when a thing has been held in too long. "The day after his funeral, I was told to leave Hartwell Court. I was given a suitcase, and I was permitted to keep a few books, nothing more." Ladies exchanged shocked glances. Somewhere, a gentleman set down his glass. "I was 18. I had nowhere to go." Her voice trembled and she let it, because she had stopped trying to be anything but honest. "So I worked. I cleaned inns. I washed laundry until my hands bled. I scrubbed floors and stood over kitchen stoves. And I studied at night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, because I had decided I would become a nurse." She glanced down at her own hands, hands that had once been soft. "It took me 8 years, but I did it." No one laughed now. No one whispered. The room was beginning to see her differently, and she could feel the moment turning under her feet like a tide. Beatrice was staring at her as though she'd never seen her before. The woman in front of her sounded nothing like the selfish creature she had heard about across 8 years of her mother's quiet, steady telling. "If all of that is true," Beatrice said, and her voice cracked on it, "why did you never write to us?" The question landed harder than any of Cordelia's cruelties. "I did. No, I wrote dozens of times. Not to me." Beatrice's face had gone white. "What are you talking about? I never had a single letter from you." "I wrote after my first year away," Rosalind said. "I wrote when I began my studies. I wrote when I fell ill. And I wrote the week I qualified." Her eyes filled, and she did not wipe them. "I wrote, Beatrice. I wrote until I couldn't bear the silence any longer. I never received a single one." And by the doorway, a strange expression crossed the face of the old grey-haired maid. Lady Adelaide missed nothing. "You there." The maid went rigid. "Step forward." The woman came, and her hands were shaking. Lady Adelaide's voice was not unkind, but it left no room to hide. "Do you know anything about these letters?" The maid's eyes flew to Cordelia. Fear and something older fought across her face, years of loyalty against years of guilt. At last, she bowed her head. "Yes, my lady." The hall erupted in murmurs. The maid pressed on, because once a thing like that begins, it cannot easily be stopped. Letters came, my lady, for Miss Beatrice. Many of them, over the years. Beatrice turned to her slowly. What happened to them? The old woman began to weep. Lady Thornbury ordered everyone brought straight to her. I saw several of them burned. In the study, in the grate, a second servant stepped out from among the staff, then a third. Each one struck harder than the last. One confirmed she had seen the letters fed to the fire. Another said she had heard Lady Cordelia laugh and say the Hartwell girl would tire of trying eventually. The careful story that had stood unchallenged for 8 years began to come apart, piece by piece, in front of 300 people. Beatrice looked as though the floor had been pulled out from under her. "You lied to me." Cordelia's composure finally cracked. "Beatrice, listen to me. You lied to me for years." Her daughter's voice was rising now, and the whole room held its breath to hear it. "I thought she abandoned us. She didn't abandon us. You threw her out." The accusation rang off the marble. For the first time, Cordelia let the mask drop entirely. "Everything I did for this family." "No," Beatrice said, stepping back from her. "You did it for yourself." And across the room, the Duke of Ravensworth stood very still. Edmund Ravensworth had listened to every word. The woman he was to marry in the morning had been deceived for 8 years. Her mother had sat at the heart of that deception and warmed her hands at the fire that burned the proof. He had watched a scandal of the ugliest kind unfold in front of hundreds of witnesses, and somewhere in the middle of it, he had understood something cold and clear. The trust a marriage is built on simply was not there. It had been hollowed out before he ever arrived. He set down his glass. The small sound of it carried. Then, in front of the assembled aristocracy of half of England, the Duke spoke 6 words that emptied the air from the room. "There will be no wedding tomorrow." For several seconds, no one moved. The ballroom seemed frozen in disbelief. Then it broke. Conversation detonated across the hall. Ladies pressed hands to their mouths. Gentlemen exchanged stunned looks. Guests came up out of their chairs, hungry to be the first to carry the story home. The musicians quietly lowered their instruments. The footmen stood like statues along the walls. A wedding that was meant to rule the society columns for a season had collapsed inside the hour. The Duke offered no further explanation. He inclined his head once, to no one in particular, turned, and walked out of the ballroom. Beatrice stared after him, the color gone from her face, the white roses in her hair suddenly only flowers from a celebration that had ceased to exist. And Rosalind, in the middle of all of it, had never felt more out of place. She had not come for this. She had not come for revenge. She had come to see her sister. And instead, 8 years of lies had gone off like a powder magazine in front of every titled stranger in the county. As the guests began drifting out, Lady Adelaide Wycliffe crossed the room to her. Where everyone else was electric, the old woman was calm. "I think you and I should speak somewhere quieter." She led Rosalind into a small drawing room overlooking the western gardens, where the evening had begun to draw long blue shadows across the trimmed hedges. A servant brought tea and withdrew. For a while neither spoke. Then Lady Adelaide reached into her reticule and drew out a folded slip of paper. "There is something I should like you to have." Written on it was an address in London. Rosalind looked up, uncomprehending. "The Royal Infirmary," Lady Adelaide said. "The Crown has lately expanded its medical service. They are in want of nurses, good ones, trained ones. Women who do not faint at the sight of real work. I have written your name beside that address, and a line or two besides." Rosalind blinked. The thing felt too large to be real. "I'm not certain I would even be accepted, my lady." The old woman smiled. "You completed your training with no family, no money, and no name to open doors. If merit still counts for anything in this kingdom, and I have made it my business, at my age, to insist that it does. They would be fools not to have you. She reached out and pressed Rosalind's hand once, firmly. Do not let other people's cruelty decide your future. You have given it 8 years already. That is quite enough. Rosalind could not get the thank you past the tightness in her throat. She managed it in the end. When she left Thornbury Hall that night, she carried far more than she had brought. Not wealth, not status. Hope, which is heavier and worth more than either. Back inside the hall, the air had turned poisonous. Most of the guests had fled the scandal. The long tables stood under the candles, heaped with food no one would touch now, the roasted pheasant, the glazed ham, the fruit tarts, the wedding cake with its little sugar figures who had nowhere left to be married. The servants began, very quietly, to clear away a feast that had become an embarrassment. In the bridal suite, Lady Cordelia Thornbury was beyond fury. This is her doing, she said. All of it. Beatrice looked up from the chair where she had collapsed. What did you say? 8 years of peace, and she chooses today, of all days, to make a spectacle. Beatrice rose slowly, and the words came out of her flat and dangerous. She made a spectacle. Of course she did. You burned her letters and told me she'd forgotten me, and now you're surprised the truth made a noise on its way out? She stared at her mother, as though seeing her for the first time, not a grieving widow, not a wronged parent, but the source of every lie she had ever been fed. You threw her out. Cordelia rolled her eyes, impatient as a woman discussing the weather. We have been over that. You destroyed her letters. I did what was necessary. The casual cruelty of it landed in Beatrice like a thrown knife. Necessary. I shut her out to protect you, Cordelia snapped. She would have poisoned you against me. She would have filled your head with grievances and taken you away from me. And I would not allow it. Everything I built so that you would marry well and rise, and you have the gall to weep over a nurse. I loved her. The words escaped before Beatrice could call them back, and with them came the tears she had been holding all night. She was my sister, and I loved her, and you let me believe she abandoned me when she was writing to me the whole time. Cordelia's patience finally gave out altogether. Then perhaps you had better go and live with her. The room went silent. The threat had been laid down plainly, without a trace of shame, and in the laying down of it, something in Beatrice came loose, and then went very, very still. If you insist on defending that girl, her mother went on, do not expect to keep your place in this house. There was no hesitation in Beatrice now, no uncertainty. She understood, at last, what mattered to her mother: power, control, position, and nothing else underneath it. Not loyalty, not family, not love. Then I'll go, Beatrice said quietly. Tonight, if you like. What neither of them knew, in that bright, cold room, was that the worst of it for Cordelia had not yet begun, because a scandal of that size does not simply fade. By the next morning, it was in every drawing room in the county, and by the end of the week, it had reached London. The story was not the one Cordelia had spent 8 years cultivating. The new story, the true one, had 300 witnesses, a duke who had cancelled his own wedding rather than be tied to the family, and a confession wept out by 3 servants in front of the entire aristocracy. There was no surviving it. The invitations stopped. That was the first thing. Lady Cordelia Thornbury, who had not gone a fortnight without a card or a dinner in 20 years, found her tray by the door empty, and then went on finding it empty. The ladies who had laughed behind their gloves at the mended dress now had a far better story to tell, and the heroine of it was not Cordelia. She was the woman who had burned a motherless girl's letters and called it love. Then came the lawyers. It emerged once people had reason to look that a good deal at Hartwell Court had been settled on the family in trust for the late lord's daughters, both of them, and that Cordelia had spent 8 years pretending one of those daughters did not exist. There were documents. There was, it turned out, a will that had never been read aloud in full, because the woman reading it had skipped the inconvenient parts. None of it would have come to light if the night of the wedding had gone the way she'd planned. All of it came to light now. Hartwell Court, the house Rosalind had been carried out of with a suitcase and a handful of books, was found, in law, to have been hers in part all along. Cordelia fought it. Of course she did, but you cannot fight 300 witnesses and a paper trail and a crown relation who has taken an interest. And she had spent the only currency she truly had, which was her reputation, and spent it on one cruel night. The court did not take long. The estate was divided as the old lord had meant it to be divided. The fine things Cordelia had treated as her own were inventoried by strangers and carried out past her while she stood in the hall and watched, exactly as she had once made a frightened 18-year-old stand and watch. She kept a small income, enough to live, somewhere modest, somewhere no one knew her face. It was, people said, more mercy than she had ever shown. Rosalind heard all of it second-hand in London, where she had a great deal else to occupy her. The Royal Infirmary had taken her. Of course it had taken her. Within a year, the matron trusted her with the difficult cases, the long nights, the patients no one else could settle. She was good, better than good, and she was kind in a way the place had been short of, and word of her spread the way word always does. Not in the society columns this time, but in the corridors where it counted. She trained the younger nurses. She fought the board for better linens and won. She set up a small ward for women who had nowhere else, the kind of women she had very nearly become, and she walked through it every morning, the way her own sister had once been carried in from the garden carefully, gently, as if every soul in it were worth carrying. It was in that ward, on an ordinary grey afternoon, that the Duke of Ravensworth came to find her. He had not come for a patient. He had been looking for her, it seemed, for the better part of a year, quietly, without fuss, the way a serious man does a serious thing. He had not been able to forget the woman in the mended dress who had stood inside a storm of cruelty and never once raised her voice. He came back, and then he came back again, and the visits stopped having any excuse attached to them. They spoke of books and duty and the strange business of living. He admired the way she had refused to break. She admired that he had walked out of a wedding rather than build a life on a lie. Neither of them hurried it. Neither of them needed to. One spring afternoon, in a London square, with the plane trees just coming into leaf, the Duke of Ravensworth asked Lady Rosalind Hartwell to be his wife. She stood quite still. The whole road that had brought her there flashed past her eyes, the suitcase, the boarding houses, the bleeding hands, the candle stubs, the long humiliation of that ballroom, the address on a folded slip of paper. Then she said yes, and she did not bother to hide the tears, because she had learned a long time ago that there was no shame in them. They were married without spectacle, which is to say they were married well. The Duchess of Ravensworth kept her ward. She never gave it up, not when the title came, not when the great houses opened their doors to her at last, the same doors that had whispered behind their gloves. She used what she had now to do what she had always done before she had anything at all. Beatrice was there, on the day. She had gone, in the end, left her mother's house with one trunk and her own 2 hands, and she had turned up at the infirmary not asking for charity but asking for work, which was the only thing her sister respected enough to give freely. They built the long road back slowly. There is no quick way to repair 8 stolen years. But Rosalind had decided, somewhere in all of it, that she would not let her mother keep the sister too. She had lost enough to that woman already. As for Cordelia, she did write, once, near the end, a short letter, in a hand grown unsteady, sent to the great house she had once schemed to keep her stepdaughter out of. She did not ask for money. She had the grace, at last, to ask for nothing at all. She wrote that she had been wrong, not wronged wrong, that she had spent her whole life certain she was protecting something and had only ever been feeding it, and that the thing she fed had eaten everything else, and that she understood now, far too late to matter, what she had thrown into that study fire, along with the letters. Rosalind read it twice. Then she folded it and put it away, and she did not answer it, and she did not burn it either. Some letters, she had learned, you keep, not out of love, and not out of hate, out of the plain refusal to become the person who sent them. She rose that morning, not because of wealth, and not because of a title, and not because anyone had finally handed her what was owed. She rose because, through 8 years that would have hardened anyone, she had never once let their cruelty take the kindness out of her heart. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created with the assistance of AI for entertainment purposes only. It is intended to convey positive messages and life lessons. It does not refer to, represent, or target any real individual, organization, or establishment. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.